Hi, my name is Gerald Parker and welcome to this tutorial on Eino. For those of you who may not know, Eino is an LLM application framework written entirely in Golang. It's open source and created by ByteDance, which is the same company that owns TikTok. I do have another video that covers more about what Eino is and kind of how I stumbled on it. It's a framework that is very similar to frameworks like LangGraph or Llama Index, with the added benefit of being written in Go. And as I said, it was developed by ByteDance, and so it's kind of been a battle-tested and mature framework that has been developing for the past couple years or so. This particular tutorial is going to cover prompt templates and chat models. If you like what you see, have any questions, or just want to see more of this, go ahead and subscribe to this channel, and let's get started. All right, so this is kind of just the agenda of what we'll cover for today. We'll talk a little bit about what Eino has to offer in terms of prompt templates and chat models. We'll go over just the brief project setup steps. We'll talk about prompt templates, the various styles that Eino has to offer, chat models, the interfaces that Eino provides. Then we'll get into kind of the messages and roles, which is a big part of working with chat models and templates. And then we'll do a brief little comparison actually between Eino and LangChain, just so you can see kind of what the syntax difference is. All right, so Eino has a lot to offer, but when it comes to prompt templates and chat models, these are just some of the highlights. And it's not limited to this. This is just some of the ones that stand out to me. As I mentioned, it's written entirely in Go, so you get type safety, which is something that you typically don't get when you're working with, Python or JavaScript. When it comes to working with the framework, it gives you template flexibility. So you have 3 styles that you can choose from, which I'll go over. And then the third one is this idea of clean abstractions. Eino is built around interfaces, and that makes it easy for you to swap out OpenAI for Claude or switch to local models like Llama without changing your application logic. Now, in order to get set up for the project, you're just going to go through these steps, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this screen. You can always pause it and execute these commands. But this tutorial kind of assumes that you have run a Go program before and are already somewhat familiar with the Go language. And of course, if you want to run these code snippets, then you are going to need an OpenAI API key, which is the model that I'll be working with. All right, so what are prompt templates? Well, if you've never worked with an LLM framework before, you may not know this, but when you do work with them, very rarely are you going to be hard coding prompts, because typically you're going to take some type of user input. And so normally you may have some piece of the hard coded prompt, but you want to be able to dynamically insert input that you gathered from the user, or be able to dynamically calculate some type of input that needs to be provided to the LLM. And in that case, what you want is some type of template where you've got some text, kind of some static text, but then you can inject the dynamic text. And so that's what prompt templates are all about. And this is not specific to Eino. There are prompt templates in pretty much every application framework that you work with. You insert placeholders into your string. And then when you format the prompt template, you provide the values which replace those placeholders. And then over here, we've just got some of the key Eino packages that are related to usages of prompt templates. So I talked about template flexibility earlier on, and Eino provides you with an option to use 3 different types of templates. So the first one here is just an FString template, and that is pretty much like a Python FString. It's simple and clean and straightforward, and it's just kind of for basic string interpolation. So you insert, as I said, a placeholder into your string, and then when you format it, you provide those values to replace it. If you're familiar with Go, you may already be familiar with GoTemplates, which offers the same benefit as FString, but it allows you to implement conditional logic. So you can modify or omit parts of the prompt based off some conditional logic, like, for example, the value of a variable, or checking to see if some variable is equal to an expected value. And the same is true for Jinja. It's just another template style that allows you to implement or inject some type of conditional logic, which is powerful when it comes to generating complex prompts. Now, if you're wondering which one of these you should go with, In my opinion, I would recommend going with the GoTemplate. Not only is that going to serve you well as a Go developer, but if you implement everything in FString, when you want to switch over to GoTemplate, then you'll have to replace all of those placeholders. And just because you use GoTemplate doesn't mean you need to implement conditional logic. You can keep it simple and do the same thing that you would do with the FString approach. So here's a complete FString example, and let me walk through this code. At the beginning here, what we do is we import the prompt template, which you can see at the top, and then the prompt.fromMessages function takes the format type first, right? So we take in FString to let our compiler know this is the type of template we want to go with. Then we pass our messages. Notice that we're using system message and user message from the schema package. And these are basically helper functions that create properly typed messages. And then you can see in there the placeholders, role, and task, and they're going to be replaced when we format the template. Down here, we construct a map for those values that we want to inject into it. We call format on that template, and then it gets replaced. And then if I run this, we can see the output of this. We can see that role was replaced by code reviewer. We can see that task was replaced with optimizing Go routines. Here's an example of the Go template with conditionals, and we can see it gets a little interesting because we have this if expert conditional. And what we're saying is that if the expert variable is true, we include additional instruction. We're going to include this as an expert in domain, summarize, topic, right? And these two are also going to be replaced by the values that we pass in, right? And they're not an expert. And so again, it's checking this value of expert that we pass in, which is going to be a Boolean. And if that's not true, then it will use this prompt template, right? And so these are the values that we pass in here, right? And if I run this, and it actually runs both instances of it, right? So we run one where expert is set to true and one where expert is set to false, and we can see the differences in the output there. And then a similar example for the Jinja template, which I said is very similar in terms of its features and functionality to Go templates. All right, so now that we understand templates, let's talk about kind of the other half of the equation of that, which are chat models. And templates and chat models in general are something that you're pretty much going to use on every Eino application. It's kind of like the core components that you're going to use. And so a chat model is really the brain of your application. It's the component that takes your messages and sends them to an LLM provider like OpenAI, Anthropic, or some local model. You can think of it like chat models are the bridge between your code and the AI. You give them messages and then they give you responses. All right, and so these are some of the providers that Eino has built-in support for, and it's not limited to this. It's just the primary ones that stick out to me. And then again, I've got the key Eino packages here, and we'll talk about the base chat model. Now, when you create a chat model, you're always going to have to pass in some type of configuration for it. And when you instantiate an OpenAI chat model, well, then you're going to pass in a OpenAI chat model config. And I'm not going to go through every field in here, but the most important ones is that you're going to always need to provide some type of API key. You're going to need to select some model. And then the other choices are typically optional. And the ones that you choose to use are going to be based off of the complexity of your use case and how much control you want over the output of the model. And so I encourage you to take a look at the configuration, which is in the source code. It's something good to know because you're always going to have to pass in some type of configuration struct. I mentioned at the beginning that Eino is all about interfaces, and this is the interface for a chat model. So all of those chat models that I showed you earlier, OpenAI, Anthropic, Gemini, all of those have to implement this interface, and that makes it really easy to swap out models because the functions that accept these models don't accept the concrete type, they accept interfaces. And that also means that you can construct your own custom model as long as it implements this interface. And it's very simple. The model has to have a generate method and a stream method. Now you're going to use generate whenever you want to send messages and get back a complete response. And stream is going to be used when you want to stream a response token by token. And that's the kind of streaming that you typically see when you're working with LLMs like ChatGPT and Gemini. It's streamed out to you as it produces the response. The key pieces worth noting in the signature is that each of them takes a slice of pointer to schema.message, and we'll talk about what that message struct looks like later. And then they each have variadic parameters, which allows you to modify some of the configurations that are set in the ChatModel config that we just took a look at. So here's a complete example using the generate method. So first off, what we're going to do is we create our ChatModel using the new ChatModel from the OpenAI package. And as I mentioned, we pass in the OpenAPI key and select a model, right? So you can kind of imagine that we may have constructed these messages from some prompt template. And then we call the generate method, which sends the messages to OpenAI and returns the complete response. It also returns an error, which I'm not handling here. But if you're familiar with Go, I absolutely know you're familiar with handling errors. And then we print out the content. So if I run this, this is along the lines of what you'll see, but probably not exactly, since of course these models are non-deterministic. But now let's take a look at the streaming example. So you can see right off the bat that when you call this stream method, everything is pretty much the same. The only difference is how you handle the output, right? So instead of just receiving the complete response, what happens is that it returns a stream reader, and you can loop through that stream reader and print out the messages. And it continues to do this until it receives this end of file error. Now, this idea of messages has popped up a few times, so it would be ideal if we at least have an understanding of what these messages are and what they look like. In general, messages are the container that's going to hold the content that you send to the LLM, as well as the container that the LLM is going to respond with. The most important fields here are the role, which is something that always needs to be filled out because the role identifies who sent the message. And you essentially have 4 options for role. And I'll talk a little bit about what each of those are on the next slide, but the role is something that always must be provided. And then you always need some type of content. Now, content is the main text of the message. And for most use cases, that's all you need. But Eino also supports multimodal content. So in that scenario, what you would likely use is the user input multi-content. And that allows you to pass in images, audio, videos, or files. And the same thing for assistant gen multi-content. Most of the time, the output is going to be within this content field. But if you are expecting to receive back some type of a multimodal response like audio or a file, then that message is going to be within the assistant gen multi-content field, which holds generated multimodal outputs. The tool related fields are for function calling. The response meta field contains metadata like token usage. And then you've also got reasoning content, which, as it says, is going to hold reasoning information if you are using a model that provides that type of output. And then extras is a flexible map for any custom data that you need to attach, but it's not passed to a model. In fact, some of these are only passed back from the model, but if you pass messages to the model, then the model doesn't interpret those. So really, I think the only messages that are interpreted when you call the model is content, user input multi-content, and then the tool fields. When it comes to roles, these are the 4 roles. You have the system message, which is the instructions to the LLM that tells it how it should behave or defines its persona. You've got the user message, which is the input from the user, the assistant message, which is what will be populated in the response, and then you've got tool messages, which are results from tool function calls. And if you aren't familiar with tools or function calls, don't worry about it. We're going to cover that in a later video, but these are the 4 types of messages that you can have. So here is really the complete flow from template to response. And this is the core pattern that you'll use in pretty much every Eino application, right? You're going to create your template using prompt.fromMessages. You'll define the structure with placeholders. You'll call format with map value so that you can get back real messages. and then you'll have that slice and you'll inject it into the call when you call model.generate, or when you call model.stream, and then you'll either get back a single message or you'll get back a stream of messages. Now, once you understand this flow, everything else pretty much builds on top of it. Templates give you reusability, chat models give you flexibility, and messages allow you to connect them. Now, you might be thinking at this point is, well, what about conversation history? Because we really haven't covered that, right? I've showed you guys how to construct new messages and pass them into the provider when you call the model. But what about existing chat history, which the model needs to be aware of so that it has a contextual understanding of the conversation and what's already been discussed? And that's where MessagesPlaceholder comes in. So MessagesPlaceholder is a special component that lets you inject an entire slice of messages into your template. And if we look at this template structure, we can see we have a system message at the top, and then a message placeholder for history, and then the user's current message. When you format this, the placeholder gets replaced with all of the previous conversation turns. So the AI in this case is going to see the full context of the conversation, and it will know what has been discussed before. Now, the syntax for using a messages placeholder, which is a function, is that you pass in a key value, and that's the key that you're going to refer to when you pass in the map to that format call. And then it's got this value, which is whether or not the history, the messages, previous messages, needs to be passed in or not, right? So when you construct this template, you need to determine, all right, do I want to make it required that message history is passed in when we format this template, or do we want to make it so that it's acceptable if there's no message history that exists? And this will of course be based off your own use case. And here we have a complete example of how this works in code. So we create a template with 3 parts here. Right, so we've got system message placeholder, and we've given it a key of history, and we're saying false, which means that it is not optional whether or not this needs to be provided. So if I set false here and a history is not provided, then this will return error when we call the format method on the template. And then of course we're passing in the user message, which also is going to have to be passed in as a value when we format this. Here, we construct our simulated conversation history, which in our case would be a previous exchange where the user asks, what is Go? And then we format the template, passing in this history, this conversation history for that history key, and the user input is set as the value to the question key. We run this code, and you would expect to get something back like this. And keep in mind, I'm only formatting the messages. I didn't actually pass the messages to a chat model and call the generate or stream function. You guys have already seen that. So as soon as I've got these messages here, it's the same as you saw before. I'm just going to pass it into the generate or stream method and get back my response. Now, I have worked heavily both with Eino and LangChain. I thought it would be cool just to give you guys a comparison of how similar the syntax of these frameworks are. And Eino makes it no secret that they borrow heavily from, LangChain and LangGraph. And so if you look at this, both Eino and LangChain, they have this concept of prompt templates. And as I mentioned earlier, this is common for other frameworks as well. But I mean, you can see it's like pretty much the exact same lines of code. Golang is always going to be a little bit more verbose just because it is a statically typed language versus dynamically typed. But that's not a bad thing because with that, you get the type safety. And so, yeah, this is just really interesting to me just to see how similar they are. And what this means is that regardless of which one you choose to learn first, whether you're coming over from LangChain or this is the first framework you're working with, it's going to help you with a little bit of learning the other one as well, which I think is great news. I've been working with Eino most recently, but I feel like there's so much similarity I could hop right over to LangChain or LangGraph at any point in time and pick right back up where I left off. So let's just do a little recap of what we covered today. You guys have learned how to work with prompt templates in Eino. You learned about the various template styles that the framework offers. You learned how to construct prompt templates from the from messages method, and then calling format to pass in the actual values. We went over the chat models, the interfaces, the various models that Eino supports. We went over the different types of messages and how to construct them along with message history. And so if you got all of this, you have a strong foundation at this point and you're ready to go to the next level. In the next tutorial, we're going to talk about chains and callbacks. I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Thanks for watching.